A millionaire forced his daughter to marry the humble gardener to punish her. However, he was stunned by what she did. In his grand office, Franklin Parker sat silently, a sweeping view of the Wind Valley churchyard stretching endlessly before him. The golden glow of the late afternoon cast a warm light over the hills, but Franklin's mind was miles away, clouded by frustration. His daughter, Sophia, had overstepped her boundaries once again. The private investigator's report lay open on his desk, each line a testament to her latest act of rebellion. Sophia had entangled herself with some irresponsible youth from Los Angeles, a brash young man who seemed to attract trouble. Franklin's jaw clenched in anger. He had poured every resource into her life: money, prestigious education, endless opportunities, and yet, this was how she chose to repay him. He had tried to reason with her, but Sophia, headstrong and independent, constantly defied his rules. Ever since her mother's passing, Franklin had taken it upon himself to control every facet of her life, convinced it was the only way to keep her safe from the harshness of the world beyond their luxurious estate. But now his grip on her seemed to be slipping. This was no longer about a man, it was about discipline and respect. He refused to let Sophia squander her future on a reckless romance with someone who offered her no future. Franklin needed to show her the consequences of defiance, a lesson so lasting that she wouldn't dare repeat her mistakes. An idea, dark and severe, began to take shape in his mind. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number he knew by heart. "Albert, could you come by the office? We need to talk," he said firmly when the line connected. Albert, the faithful gardener of their estate, was as reliable as the sunrise. For years, he had tended the churchyard and gardens with a quiet dedication. A humble man, Albert asked for little, just a fair wage and the satisfaction of a day's hard work. But today, Albert was about to be drawn into Franklin's web of control. Minutes later, Albert knocked on the door, respectfully stepping in and removing his cap. "Mr. Parker, you wanted to see me." His voice was steady, but a hint of apprehension showed in his eyes. Franklin took a moment to study the man before him. Albert was in his early 30s, rugged from years of outdoor labor, with a quiet presence that exuded calm. He embodied everything Sophia disdained: modesty, simplicity, a lack of ambition for material wealth. But to Franklin, these were exactly the qualities he needed for his plan. "Yes, Albert, I have a proposal for you," Franklin began, leaning back in his leather chair. "It involves my daughter, Sophia." Albert's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sophia?" Franklin nodded, his gaze turning sharp and cold. "I'm sure you've noticed her behavior. She's been reckless, irresponsible, and determined to ruin her future. I can't stand by and let that happen." Albert remained silent, the frown deepening on his face. Like everyone on the estate, he knew Sophia. She was stunning, intelligent, and headstrong, the kind of woman unafraid to voice her discontent. "I want her to understand responsibility, Albert. To learn that life isn't about indulgence or rebellion," Franklin continued. "So I've decided she will marry you." The air grew heavy, and for a moment, Albert looked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Marry me," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Franklin replied. "You're diligent, reliable, grounded. Everything Sophia needs to see up close. She'll finally understand what life is like for those who earn their keep. And for you," Franklin added, his tone softening, "there will be financial rewards." Albert stared, expression unreadable. "Sir, I'm just the gardener. Sophia, she doesn't care for me. This doesn't feel right." Franklin waved a dismissive hand. "This isn't about feelings, Albert, it's about teaching her a lesson. You'd be doing her a long-term favor. She needs to grow up, and you can help her do that." Silence settled thickly between them, Franklin's words hanging ominously in the air. Albert shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance out the window toward the churchyard, as if the vines might somehow offer escape from this proposition. I don't know, Mr. Parker," Albert began, but Franklin cut him off with a cold finality. "This isn't a choice, Albert. Neither of you have one." Albert lowered his gaze, sensing any protest would be futile. Franklin Parker had made his decision, and there was no undoing it. Later that night, Sophia returned to the stars after a day in the city, her heels echoing against the marble floors, unaware of the storm brewing within its walls. Franklin waited for her in the drawing room, his presence one of cold authority. "Sophia," he called as she passed by. She sighed, irritation flashing in her eyes. "What now, Dad?" "I don't need another one of your lectures." Franklin stood, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "There won't be any more lectures, Sophia. You've made your choices, and now you'll deal with the consequences." Her eyebrows rose as she folded her arms, defiant. "What are you talking about? You're getting married," Franklin declared, his voice calm but unmistakably resolute. Sophia froze, shock washing over her. "Married? To who?" "To Albert, the gardener." Franklin's gaze never wavered from hers. In an instant, Sophia's shock turned to rage. What? Are you insane? You can't be serious. Franklin's tone grew steely. Oh, I'm very serious, Sophia. In 2 days, you'll marry Albert, and maybe then you'll understand what it's like to live in the real world. The following days passed in a blur of disbelief and fury for Sophia. She tried everything to change his mind, pleading, yelling, even threatening to disappear. But her father remained firm, unyielding. Franklin Parker was a man used to control, and this marriage was simply another means of asserting his dominance over her life. Standing before the mirror in her room at Athena House, Sophia stared at her reflection in a simple white dress, a far cry from the grand gown she'd once dreamed of. Her hair was carefully pinned up, but there was no trace of excitement, no glimmer of joy. Only a hollow emptiness filled her heart. She shook her head, whispering to her reflection, I can't believe this is really happening. Her own gaze met hers, unreadable and cold, mirroring the weight of a choice that had never truly been hers. This act of defiance, a forced marriage, a life redefined, was Franklin's attempt to control her once more, but he was about to be more surprised than he could ever imagine. Outside, the morning sun radiated brightly, casting a gentle warmth over the expansive gardens of the stars, the Parker family estate. For Sophia, however, the sunlight may as well have been a distant memory, its warmth unable to penetrate the icy reality she faced. She felt confined, ensnared in a life that no longer felt like her own, pushed into a marriage she had never chosen. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Of course, it was her father, coming to ensure she hadn't tried to escape or change her mind. Sophia, Franklin's tone was firm as he entered. It's time. She turned to him, her eyes flashing with defiance. You know this is wrong, don't you? Franklin's gaze didn't falter. It's for your own good, Sophia. In time, you'll come to understand. She clenched her fists, her resolve mixed with bitterness. Resistance was pointless now. She would go through with it, but she promised herself she'd make him regret this. Following him downstairs into the chardyard garden, where a modest gathering awaited, her mind raced. The weight of the life she was about to enter pressed down on her, a life bound to Albert, a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. It was humiliating, yet it was happening, and there was no turning back. Albert stood quietly by the floral archway, looking just as out of place as she felt. He was dressed in a plain suit, his rugged features softened by the occasion's formal setting. Yet, despite his unease, a calm acceptance lingered in his expression, something that only frustrated Sophia more. How could he just comply so passively? The officiant waited, smiling as if this were a joyous occasion, and Sophia suppressed an urge to roll her eyes. There was no joy here. Her mind drifted, fixated on thoughts of escape. Anything to avoid the life being forced upon her. Albert's steady voice interrupted her reverie as he spoke his vows. He looked at her directly, and for an instant Sophia saw something surprising in his eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared predicament. He wasn't happy about this either, naturally. He hadn't asked for this any more than she had, but here he was, fulfilling his role as much as she was. When her turn came, the words tasted bitter on her tongue. I do, she whispered, the phrase barely audible. And with those words it was done. She was now Mrs. Albert, whoever he truly was. She realized she hadn't even asked. As the brief ceremony concluded, the few onlookers clapped politely, but there was no warmth, no joy. This was merely an agreement, a contract, nothing more. Sophia cast a hard glare toward her father, who stood with arms crossed, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. She wanted to scream, to tell him he'd stolen her life, but she managed only a cold, wordless glare. Albert approached, extending his arm. An uncomfortable gesture of tradition. Sophia hesitated before accepting, the touch feeling distant and hollow. They walked back toward Athena House in silence, neither able to find the words. Once inside, Franklin immediately set the terms. You'll live in Athena House, he said, his tone all business. It's modest but will serve your needs. Sophia shot him a withering look. Of course it's modest. That's exactly the point, isn't it? Franklin ignored her scorn. You'll share this space as husband and wife. It's time you learned what life really entails. Sophia, she wanted to argue, to fight back, but the day's events had drained her completely. Resigned, she nodded silently, accepting her fate. Albert, quiet throughout, maintained a neutral expression. Sophia couldn't read his thoughts, and frankly, she didn't care. She just wanted solitude. Without another word, she turned and made her way to Athena House, leaving Albert and her father behind. The small house, while modest compared to the stars, was still larger than anything she had known outside her family's opulent world. She crossed the threshold, and the reality of her situation settled in fully. This was her new life? No luxury, no freedom? She was now tethered to Albert in this confined space, which felt as imprisoning as any cage. A few moments later, Albert quietly entered, closing the door behind him. "I'm sorry, Sophia," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Sophia whirled around, anger flashing in her eyes. "What I wanted. None of this was my choice." She took a steadying breath, tamping down the resentment bubbling within. "But I guess that doesn't matter now, does it? We're both trapped." Albert's gaze lowered, his face somber. "I suppose so." They stood in silence, their union a weight neither wanted but now shared. Sophia knew, despite any resolve, that life would never be the same. The next morning, Sophia woke, a familiar heaviness settling over her. Athena House, with its simple decor and cozy atmosphere, bore no resemblance to the lavish rooms she had once known. No silk sheets, no grand windows, only plain curtains and a small, creaky bed. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling, wishing this were a nightmare from which she might awaken. But the sound of dishes clattering in the kitchen brought her back to harsh reality. This was real. She was married to Albert, the gardener, and there was no escaping it. Sighing, she threw off the covers and shuffled to the bathroom. The cold water splashed on her face, and she caught her own weary reflection. Her hair was a mess, her eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep. The confident, carefree woman she once knew was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized, a stranger imprisoned in a life not of her choosing. Emerging from the bedroom, she found Albert already at the small kitchen table, quietly sipping coffee. He looked up, a tentative smile on his face. "Good morning," he greeted softly. She ignored him, reaching for a bottle of water from the fridge. She wasn't in the mood for politeness, especially not with the man who was now technically her husband. No matter how gentle Albert appeared, she couldn't forget the circumstances, nor would she make things easy. "You should eat something," he offered, his voice calm but persistent. "I made eggs." She glanced briefly at the scrambled eggs on the table. They looked decent, but her appetite was non-existent. Taking a long sip of water, she placed the bottle down with a loud thud. "I'm not hungry," she replied flatly. Albert nodded, his expression unreadable, returning to his coffee. The silence stretched, awkward and heavy, as the tension between them lingered like an invisible fog. Sophia felt his gaze on her, but she refused to meet his eyes. She needed air, an escape from the suffocating tension filling the house. Grabbing her jacket from the hook by the door, she stepped outside, letting the door slam shut behind her. The fresh morning air hit her face, offering a fleeting moment of relief, but it wasn't enough to ease the frustration building within. Athena House sat on the edge of the sprawling charred yard, the grapevines stretching endlessly across the estate's boundaries. The soft morning sun cast a golden glow over the meticulously arranged rows, with mountains rising in the distance, majestic yet indifferent. It should have been breathtaking, serene even, but Sophia felt none of it. She began walking, her strides quick and deliberate, as if distance could somehow quiet the storm raging inside her. She didn't know where she was headed, nor did she care. She only knew she couldn't remain in that house any longer, surrounded by Albert and the harsh truth of her new life. As she wandered through the charred yard, flashes of her old life flooded Sophia's mind, browsing shops on Rodeo Drive, lavish dinners with friends, jet-setting to private islands. Everything she had once taken for granted now felt impossibly far away. Her father had stripped it all from her with this so-called punishment, leaving her stranded in what felt like a waking nightmare. Frustration bubbled up as she kicked at the dirt, sending small stones skittering into the vines. "This is so ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. "I don't belong here. I shouldn't be stuck with him." She kept walking, letting the charred yard envelop her, rows of green and gold stretching on like an endless maze. But as the sun climbed higher, she knew she couldn't put off the inevitable forever. Eventually, she would have to return to Athena House. Albert would still be there, quiet and unbothered, waiting for her to acknowledge him. His calm acceptance infuriated her. How could he simply accept this situation without protest? By the time she reached Athena House, the kitchen was empty. Albert had cleaned up from breakfast and disappeared, likely out working in the garden. A pang of guilt flickered in her mind, knowing he'd tried to be considerate. But she brushed it away. Kindness wasn't the issue here. Her entire life had been turned upside down, and no gesture, not even scrambled eggs, would change that. She drifted into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. Time seemed to slow, each hour stretching as Sophia wrestled with the question of what to do now. There were no parties to attend, no shopping sprees to plan. Her days of indulgence were gone, likely for the foreseeable future. As evening began to settle, she heard the door creak open and Albert stepped inside, his face flushed and dusted with remnants of a day's work. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he glanced at her, his gaze searching for something. "I'm making dinner," he said after a pause. "You're welcome to join me." Sophia didn't respond, simply crossing her arms and staring ahead. Albert waited, then turned quietly to the kitchen. The gentle clatter of pots and pans broke the silence, and for a fleeting moment, she considered slipping out, just to escape the tension. Yet something kept her rooted, something she couldn't quite name. Sitting there, listening to the familiar sounds of cooking, Sophia came to a realization: Albert wasn't resisting her anger. He wasn't responding with frustration or resentment. Instead, he seemed to be giving her space, allowing her to process things in her own way. It was both maddening and, in some strange way, oddly reassuring. The next morning, Sophia awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, a stark contrast to the constant hum of city life she was used to. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, until reality swept over her, heavy as ever. She was still at Athena House, still bound in this forced marriage with Albert. Nothing had changed. Sighing, she sat up, running her hands through her tangled hair. Through the small window, she saw Albert already working in the garden, carefully tending to a patch of flowers, his focus unwavering. Even from a distance, she could see the concentration etched into his features, as if the entire world faded away when he was at work. Sophia walked over to the window and watched him for a moment. She'd never understood people like Albert, those who found contentment in simplicity. To her, life was all about speed, luxury hotels, and exclusivity. Yet, for Albert, it seemed that a day spent outdoors working with his hands was enough. It didn't make sense to her, yet there was a small part of her that felt a spark of curiosity. What was it like to live in a world unhurried, with a rhythm dictated by nature, a world where fulfillment came from the soil itself and one's labor? Shaking her head, Sophia turned from the window, resolving to simply get through her morning. She wasn't interested in understanding Albert or his way of life, she was just biding her time, waiting for the chance to reclaim her real life. But the days dragged on, and that chance felt nowhere in sight. That afternoon, Sophia found herself walking aimlessly across the estate, her steps bringing her closer to the garden where Albert was working. She hadn't planned to speak to him, but something about his presence among the plants, moving with a quiet grace, piqued her interest. She lingered at the edge of the garden, watching as he moved from one flower bed to the next, his hands skillfully pruning and shaping the greenery. Albert worked with a focus she hadn't seen before, different from the relentless ambition that had fueled her father's world of business deals and high-stakes negotiations. This was slower, more intentional, and strangely serene. Watching him, Sophia noticed something unexpected. Albert seemed unhurried, completely absorbed in his work. He didn't rush through the tasks. Each action appeared deliberate, as if he found joy in the process itself, not just the outcome. Every so often, he would pause to wipe his brow or examine a plant more closely, as if the rest of the world faded away. She was surprised to find herself fascinated by his quiet determination. It was calming in a way she couldn't understand, even if she still didn't grasp how anyone could be content with such a simple life. After a while, Albert seemed to sense her presence. He looked up, catching her gaze across the garden. Standing up, he brushed dirt off his hands and offered a small, welcoming smile. "Hey," he greeted as he walked over. "Didn't think you'd be out here." Sophia shrugged, crossing her arms defensively. "There wasn't anything better to do." Albert nodded, glancing back at the garden. "I understand. It's not exactly thrilling around here, but it has its peace." "Peace," Sophia echoed, a touch of mockery in her voice. "Is that really all you want? Just peace?" Albert tilted his head thoughtfully, mulling over her question. "I guess so. I never felt the need for much else." Sophia stared at him, baffled. "You've never wanted more? No ambitions? No grand dreams?" Albert smiled, but his gaze held something deeper, something Sophia couldn't quite pinpoint. "Ambition was never my goal. I like waking up, knowing I'll be doing work I love. There's a kind of joy in watching things grow, knowing you had a part in it." Sophia frowned, struggling to understand how anyone could be content with so little. Yet she realized that Albert wasn't one to chase wealth or status. He was different. "You don't get bored?" she asked, genuinely curious. Albert chuckled softly. "Not really. There's always something to tend to, something to repair or nurture. It's never dull when you appreciate the small things." Sophia didn't reply. She wasn't sure how to process his perspective. The little things had never mattered to her. Life was supposed to be grand, filled with excitement and luxury. But as she stood there, watching Albert's simple satisfaction, she wondered if maybe she'd overlooked something. Not that she was ready to admit it. Good for you, I guess, she muttered, brushing off the thought. But it still seems ridiculous. Albert just smiled, undeterred by her dismissal. You don't have to understand, Sophia. It's just who I am. A long silence settled between them, broken only by the gentle rustling of the chardyard leaves in the breeze. Sophia shifted uneasily, the weight of Albert's words pressing on her like a heavy blanket she couldn't quite shake. You should give it a try sometime, Albert said finally, his tone light, yet sincere. Might surprise you. Sophia scoffed, rolling her eyes. Me? In a garden? Not happening. Albert chuckled softly, giving a small shrug. Suit yourself. He turned back to his work, leaving Sophia standing there, once again watching him. An unfamiliar feeling stirred within her, something between confusion and intrigue. She didn't understand Albert, and a part of her didn't want to. But there was a small, nagging part of her that wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something worth learning from him. She quickly dismissed the thought. She wasn't about to be swayed by the simplicity of Albert's life. She had a world waiting for her, filled with glamour, excitement, and power. This was only a phase, temporary at best. But as she turned to head back to Athena House, Sophia couldn't resist glancing back at Albert one last time, feeling a quiet tug at something deep inside, something she wasn't quite ready to face. Days turned into a steady rhythm at Athena House, and Sophia found herself settling into an odd routine. The resentment she felt toward her father's decree still lingered, but something was changing, despite her best efforts to resist. It started each morning. She would awaken to birdsong and the warm morning sun filtering through the thin curtains of the guest house. At first, she'd lie in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, dreading each day. But gradually, she began noticing the sounds outside, the breeze rustling the leaves, the subtle stir of life just beyond the walls she'd mentally constructed around herself. Albert was always up before her, out in the garden or working around the estate. His steady presence, once an irritation, now brought a strange sense of calm. She kept her distance, of course. She wasn't about to romanticize her life here or imagine a perfect union with the gardener. But she couldn't deny that something had shifted. One morning, standing by the window watching him work, she felt a quiet admiration. Albert moved with a natural grace, his hands carefully tending to each plant, as though he understood them on an unspoken level. There was a rhythm to his work, a confidence that could only come from years of dedication, and despite herself, Sophia couldn't help but respect it. The transformation was subtle, but real. Little by little, she found herself drawn to the world around her, the vibrant colors of the flowers, the warmth of the sun, the gentle sigh of the wind as it swept through the chardyard. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch with a book, Albert approached with a basket of freshly picked vegetables, his shirt stained with the day's labor. Mind if I sit? He asked, nodding at the empty chair beside her. Sophia shrugged, not taking her eyes off her book. Do what you want. Albert smiled faintly and took the seat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, yet it wasn't quite warm either. It was somewhere in between, familiar yet distant, like the quiet shared with someone you thought you knew but didn't really know at all. I've been thinking, Albert said at last, breaking the silence, about you being here and about how things have been. Sophia glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Oh, really? And what's on your mind? Albert kept his gaze on the basket in his hands, fingers absently toying with a sprig of thyme. I know this isn't what you wanted, I get that. But does it have to be so terrible? Sophia scoffed, her defenses flaring. So terrible? Albert, I'm living in a guest house on my father's land, married to a man I barely know, all because I was forced. You actually think this situation isn't miserable? Albert chuckled softly, shaking his head. I'm not saying it's ideal. But you've been here for a while now. You've seen the way things work here. Maybe it's not what you're used to, but it's not all bad, right? Sophia bit back a sharp retort, but the words stalled in her throat. The truth was, she didn't know how to feel anymore. Albert must have sensed her hesitation because he spoke again. I'm not asking you to like it here. I just think, maybe there's something worth noticing. Something simple, maybe even worthwhile. Sophia rolled her eyes, though her tone lacked its usual edge. Gardening. You think that's what's worth my attention? Albert's smile grew slightly, genuine and unbothered. Perhaps. You'd be surprised. You're welcome to join me anytime. Sophia shook her head, but she couldn't fight the small smile forming on her lips. Yeah, I don't think so. They sat together a while longer, letting the conversation drift as the day softened into dusk. She watched as the sun dipped low, casting long, golden shadows across the chardyard. The light filtered through the leaves, casting a tranquil glow over everything, the air growing quiet as evening settled. For once, Sophia didn't feel an urge to escape. She wasn't clawing to break free or run back to her old life. The anger toward her father lingered, and the frustration over her circumstances hadn't vanished. But deep inside, something was shifting. She was beginning to see things she'd never noticed, the subtle beauty and the simple, and maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand. As the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, Sophia stood and stretched. "I'm heading inside," she said, her tone casual. Albert nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "All right, see you around." Walking back to Athena House, she realized her feelings had changed, even if she couldn't pinpoint how. This life wasn't perfect, and she still wasn't sure of her future, but she no longer felt completely adrift. There was something here, something calming, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of that calm came from Albert too. Days drifted by, and life at Athena House settled into a gentle rhythm. Each morning brought birdsong and the soft rustle of the chardyard leaves. Albert's presence, once an irritation, became as familiar as the sunrise, the warmth of a gentle breeze through the fields. Yet, despite the calm around her, Sophia's emotions remained turbulent. She couldn't deny the quiet changes taking hold within. The fierce anger she once nursed was softening, and she resented it. She didn't want to release that fire it had sustained her, given her direction. But now she found herself questioning what she had held on to for so long. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, legs curled beneath her, gazing out over the chardyard, her thoughts darkened. She despised the lack of clear answers. Once, her anger had been straightforward. She loathed her father, loathed Albert, and loathed this entire situation. But now, in unguarded moments, she felt not happiness, but a measure of peace that unnerved her. Albert worked nearby, and she realized she'd started watching him more often, not romantically, but drawn by something unexplainable. He was steady, grounded, and satisfied with a life she would have once scorned. Despite its modesty, the small life she was now a part of encompassed everything Sophia had once looked down upon. Yet somehow she found herself wondering if there was more to life than the whirlwind she'd been pursuing for so long. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with Albert a few days ago, when he had gently suggested there might be something worth appreciating here. She had scoffed then, but now maybe he had a point. Perhaps there was something valuable in this slower, simpler way of living, but acknowledging that brought its own set of troubling questions. What would it mean for the life she'd led up to now if she truly found value in simplicity? Had her previous life been empty, defined only by shallow pursuits? Sophia shook her head, as though trying to ward off these uncomfortable thoughts. She wasn't ready to confront those kinds of reflections yet. Her whole identity had been built around wealth, prestige, and the allure of finer things. And here she was, in a modest little place like Athena House, starting to entertain the notion that those things may not hold the significance she once thought they did. Restless, Sophia stepped outside, seeking movement as a way to evade her thoughts. She wandered through the chardyard, trailing her fingers along the leaves as she passed, breathing in the cool air as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting soft shadows over the rows of vines. For the first time, she noticed a beauty here that had eluded her before. Eventually, she reached the edge of the property and saw Albert sitting on a small stone wall, his hands resting quietly in his lap as he gazed out over the chardyard. He looked lost in thought, and for a moment, Sophia hesitated. She wasn't even sure why she had walked this way or why she felt the need to talk to him, but here she was. "Hey," she said gently, taking a step closer. Albert looked up and gave her a small, warm smile. "Hey, everything all right?" She shrugged, unsure how to respond. "I guess I just needed to get out of the house." Albert nodded, shifting over to make space beside him on the wall. "Have a seat," he offered. They sat there in silence, the only sounds being the soft rustle of the chardyard leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. For all the quiet around them, Sophia's mind was anything but still. "I don't get it," she said eventually, breaking the silence. Albert looked over, one eyebrow raised. "What don't you get?" "How you can be so okay with all of this," she said, gesturing at the world around them. "This life, I mean. It's so small. Don't you ever want something bigger?" Albert paused, seeming to consider her words. "Depends on what you mean by bigger." "I mean more," Sophia replied, her voice edged with frustration. "More excitement, more success, more money, more everything. How can you be content with so little?" Albert gave a small smile, his expression thoughtful. For me, it's about what matters. It's not the money or the thrill. It's knowing that I'm building something, watching it grow. That, to me, is everything I need. Sophia shook her head slowly, struggling to understand. But don't you feel like you're missing out on more? Albert chuckled, a soft, knowing sound. Maybe to some folks it would look that way. But I don't feel like I'm missing anything. I think people get so lost chasing after what they don't have, they forget to appreciate what's right there in front of them. His words resonated with Sophia more deeply than she had expected. She had spent her entire life chasing after more wealth, more recognition, more admiration. And now, here she was, beside someone who seemed completely satisfied with so much less. It made her question everything she thought she knew about fulfillment. A millionaire forced his daughter to marry the humble gardener to punish her, however. He was stunned by what she did. Part 2. Though small and unassuming, the simplicity surrounding her was everything Sophia Parker had once scorned. Yet, against her expectations, she found herself questioning whether there might be more to life than the constant chase for thrills and status that had defined her world. Her mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with Albert recently, when he suggested gently, yet firmly, that there could be something worth appreciating in this quieter existence. At the time, she'd laughed off his words, but now maybe he'd been onto something. Perhaps there was a lesson in the calmness of this life. But that thought opened up unsettling questions. If this simplicity held value, what did that say about the life she'd lived before? Had all those years, built on luxuries and prestige, been shallow and empty? Sophia shook her head, trying to push aside the thought. This was too much to process now. She had always been a woman who found purpose in luxury and status, someone who chased after the finer things with determination. And yet, here she was, standing in Athena House, realizing that maybe those things weren't as meaningful as she once believed. The thought of confronting her father brought a mix of fear and resolve. Franklin Parker was a towering presence, literally and figuratively, whose authority had ruled every room and every decision in her life. Growing up, she'd learned that challenging him was never without consequences, and this marriage had been his ultimate show of control. But now, in the stillness of Athena House, Sophia felt a new strength bubbling within her. She was done living under his rules and done with the leash he'd placed around her life. She grabbed her jacket and set out for the stars, the sprawling Parker estate. Each step felt weighted, the path winding through Wind Valley Chardyard like a maze of greens and golds. When she reached the front door, she paused, her hand hovering over the handle, memories of lavish parties and designer gowns, of living beneath her father's ironclad control, flickering through her mind. It had all seemed so vital once, but now it felt distant, like a memory from someone else's life. Drawing in a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. As expected, Franklin was in his office, his usual command post, and she could hear the faint hum of his voice through the heavy wooden door, likely finishing up a business call. For a brief moment, Sophia considered waiting until he was done. But no. She was done waiting. She knocked once, then opened the door without invitation. Her father looked up, visibly surprised at her abrupt entrance. Seated behind his enormous oak desk, phone in hand, he raised his eyes at her, his irritation unmistakable. Sophia, he began in that hard, clipped tone he reserved for serious matters. I'm on a call. This had better be important. She crossed her arms, grounding herself. It is. Franklin held up a finger, signaling her to wait while he concluded his call. She stood there, her jaw clenched, watching as he rattled off orders with his typical authority. This image of him, the unstoppable businessman, always controlling, had once intimidated her, but today she was ready to face him head-on. Finally, he ended the call, leaning back in his chair with a look that combined curiosity and annoyance. What do you want, Sophia? I'm very busy. Taking a steadying breath, she replied, we need to talk about this marriage arrangement. A flash of amusement crossed his eyes, and his expression shifted to one of challenge. Ah, is my daughter finally ready to come to her senses? Thinking of an annulment? Sophia shook her head, her voice calm but unwavering. No, that's not why I'm here. His brow arched, clearly taken aback. Then what? You've been in Athena House for weeks now. Surely it's not agreeing with you. I didn't come to discuss what I like or don't like. Her voice held steady. I came to tell you that I'm done letting you control me. You thought marrying me off to Albert would teach me a lesson, but it didn't work. Franklin's gaze turned dark, but he held his silence, letting her speak. Sophia stepped forward, her confidence growing with each word. You thought this would be some kind of punishment, she continued, but it's not. I've learned more about myself these past few weeks than I ever did under your control. I'm done letting you dictate my life. Slowly, Franklin rose from his chair, his presence looming over her as he locked his stern gaze on hers. So, what exactly do you plan to do, Sophia? Run off with Albert and live out your fantasy? His voice dripped with disdain. Sophia met his gaze without flinching. Maybe I will. And if I do, it will be my choice, not yours. Franklin's jaw tightened, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. You're making a fool's choice, throwing away everything I've built for you. This family has worked for generations to build a name, a legacy. Sophia didn't falter. It's not your life to control, Dad. It's mine. The silence between them grew thick, the air charged with unspoken tension. She could see the conflict in his eyes, his desire to maintain control colliding with the harsh reality that he was losing his grip. You've always been stubborn? He said at last, his voice low and dangerous. But don't forget who you're dealing with. I'm the one who made this family what it is. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. Sophia shook her head, her expression calm. You gave me everything except the freedom to choose my own path. For a moment, the weight of her words hung heavy in the room. She noticed something shift in her father's face, not anger, not disappointment, but a trace of regret, though fleeting. But Franklin was not one to surrender easily. He straightened, his tone turning colder. You want freedom, Sophia? Fine. But don't expect me to be there when you realize the world out there isn't as easy as you think. Sophia nodded, her heart racing, yet her mind clearer than it had ever been. I won't. Without another word, Sophia turned and left the office, leaving her father behind. As the door clicked shut, a strange wave of relief washed over her. The confrontation had been intense, but it was done. She had finally spoken her truth. And for the first time in years, Sophia felt she was in command of her own life. The encounter stirred a mix of emotions, anger, liberation, and an unexpected sense of freedom. She didn't yet know exactly what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: she wasn't returning to the life of luxury and control that Franklin Parker had crafted for her. When she arrived back at Athena House, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light across Wind Valley Chardyard. Albert was outside, kneeling by a bed of flowers, his hands covered in dirt as he worked with quiet focus. Sophia stood watching him for a moment, feeling an unexpected calm settle over her. Weeks had passed since their arranged marriage, and though the beginning was awkward and tense, something between them had shifted. Albert's patience and quiet strength had surprised her, and over time she found herself appreciating the small acts of kindness he offered her. He never pushed, never demanded anything in return. As he looked up and noticed her, Albert wiped his hands on his jeans and greeted her softly. You're back. How did it go? Sophia sank onto the small stone bench by the garden and let out a deep sigh. It was intense, she confessed, but I finally told him what I needed to say. Albert nodded and joined her on the bench. Good. It's been a long time coming. Sophia gave a faint smile, glancing at him. You really think so? Yes, Albert replied, his voice both gentle and firm. You've been carrying this for a while. It's good to finally get it off your chest. She leaned back, eyes drifting to the sky as it shifted from warm orange to soft pink. I just don't know what happens next. I feel like I'm stuck between two lives, the one I had before, and this one. I'm not sure where I belong. Albert sat in thoughtful silence for a moment before answering. Maybe you don't have to decide that just yet. Maybe you can just be. Sophia looked at him, taken aback by the simplicity of his words. Just be? He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, life doesn't always need to be about big choices or knowing everything. Sometimes it's okay to just live, to see what comes. Sophia let the thought settle, her mind turning it over. She had always lived with a sense of urgency, needing control, needing to anticipate every outcome. But maybe Albert was right. Maybe for once, she didn't have to have all the answers. I'm not used to that, she admitted, her tone softening. Even when I went against my father, I was still chasing something. Albert leaned back, his arm brushing hers as they sat together in a comfortable silence. I understand. But sometimes plans change. People change. Sophia felt her heart skip at his words, as if he'd echoed something deeply resonant within her. Over the past few weeks, she'd started to see Albert in a new way. He wasn't merely the gardener her father had chosen. He was kind, steady, and deeply genuine, qualities she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time, she really looked at him. There was a quiet strength in his rugged, unassuming face, in the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. More than anything, there was a warmth, a dependability that she'd come to lean on without even realizing it. "What about you?" she asked, shifting the conversation back to him. "Do you have a plan?" Albert chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think I've ever had much of one. I like things simple, taking life as it comes." Sophia smiled, feeling an unexpected flutter in her chest. "That sounds nice." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "It can be." The air between them shifted, and for a moment, Sophia felt the world fall quiet around them. She hadn't planned to feel anything for Albert, but here she was, her heart racing at the way he looked at her. "Albert," she began, her voice uncertain about this marriage. He raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. "I know we didn't have a choice," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "And I know it hasn't been perfect, but I think I'm starting to see it differently." Albert didn't respond immediately, but his gaze softened as if he already understood what she was trying to say. Taking a deep breath, Sophia felt her pulse quicken. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe this doesn't have to feel like punishment. Maybe it can be something more." Albert's eyes softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustling of the charred yard in the evening breeze. Then, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm, steady. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. Sophia nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, I think it is." Albert's smile was small but sincere, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Then we'll figure it out together." The simplicity of his words brought Sophia a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a very long time. There were still so many uncertainties, so much she hadn't yet sorted out, but for the first time, that didn't frighten her. She wasn't alone in this journey anymore. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon and the stars began to shine in the darkening sky, Sophia felt a new warmth grow inside her, one that had nothing to do with luxury or status. This was different. This was real. And for the first time, she felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the days that followed, Sophia carried a new sense of clarity, though hints of doubt lingered. She had finally admitted to herself that her feelings for Albert were genuine, that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected marriage didn't have to be punishment she had once believed. With this realization, she knew it was time to make a decision, one that would shape her future completely. It was time to stand beside Albert, not as two individuals bound by her father's will, but as true equals, as partners. It wasn't a life she'd ever pictured for herself, but it was now the one she desired more than anything else. One early morning, as the sun rose over Wind Valley Chardyard, Sophia Parker sat on the porch of Athena House, her thoughts deep and swirling. She held a steaming cup of coffee, letting its warmth seep into her hands as she watched the world wake up around her. What once felt like a symbol of entrapment, the quiet, the simplicity, had transformed into something that felt almost like home. But Sophia knew she couldn't stay in this state of in-between forever. She had to take charge, to make the decision she'd been avoiding for too long. That afternoon, she found Albert in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of flowers, trimming the plants with his familiar care. Watching him work grounded her, even as her heart raced. "Albert," she called softly, stepping closer. He looked up, a bit surprised but calm. "Hey," he greeted, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Is everything all right?" Sophia nodded, though her heart thudded in her chest. "Yes, I need to talk to you." Albert's expression shifted, a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Sure, what's on your mind?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about us, about everything since the wedding." Albert stayed quiet, allowing her the space to speak. "I know we didn't choose this," she continued, "and at first, I hated it. I hated you, this place, everything." He offered a faint smile but said nothing. "But now things feel different," Sophia went on. "I don't feel trapped anymore. I don't feel like this is some kind of punishment. In fact, I think I might actually be happy here." Her words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Albert's eyes softened and he took a step closer. "What are you saying, Sophia?" She looked down, her heart racing. "I'm saying, I want this. I want to be here with you, not because I was forced to, but because it's what I choose." Albert's expression was unreadable for a moment, as if he were absorbing her words. Then, slowly, a genuine smile spread across his face, making Sophia's heart flutter. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice soft and filled with hope. Sophia nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. "Yes, I'm serious." In a sudden rush of emotion, he wrapped her in a hug, holding her tightly. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace and the steady beat of his heart against hers. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," Albert murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia laughed softly, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Neither did I." They stood there in peaceful silence. For the first time, Sophia felt truly at ease, no anger, no resentment, just the quiet certainty that this was where she was meant to be. After a while, Albert pulled back slightly, his hands still on her shoulders. "So what does this mean?" he asked, his tone curious. Sophia smiled, feeling excitement bubble within her. "It means I want to make this real. I want to renew our vows on our own terms this time." Albert blinked, clearly taken aback. "You mean?" Sophia's smile widened. "Yes, I want to marry you for real." For a moment, Albert was speechless. Then, with a grin, he pulled her into another hug, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle. Sophia laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. When he set her down, his expression was filled with joy. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Just say yes," Sophia replied, her own smile growing. Albert laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yes, absolutely yes." They stood there in each other's arms, the chardyard around them a quiet witness to their moment. It was simple but perfect. For the first time, Sophia wasn't chasing anything. She had finally found what she needed. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, they walked hand in hand back to Athena House, talking about their future in a way they never had before. When they reached the porch, Sophia turned to Albert with a smile that felt as though it came from deep within her. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "Let's do it tomorrow." Albert nodded, his eyes shining. Tomorrow. The warm, golden light of the setting sun cast a glow over them, and Sophia knew she had made the right choice. The day following Sophia's decision felt like a fresh start, but not everyone welcomed the news. Franklin Parker had always believed his control and influence could shape his daughter's life, but the past few weeks had shattered that certainty. Sitting in his office at the Stars, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and success, he couldn't understand why Sophia hadn't fought harder to escape. Instead, she'd chosen to stay and, even worse, planned to renew her vows with Albert of her own will. The thought enraged him. How could his daughter willingly choose a life he deemed beneath her? His thoughts were interrupted by Emma, his assistant, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Parker," she began cautiously, "your daughter is here to see you." Franklin composed himself, masking his emotions. "Send her in." Sophia entered, standing taller and more self-assured than he'd ever seen her. It unsettled him. "Sophia," Franklin said, his tone clipped. "What brings you here?" She took a steadying breath. "I'm here to tell you that I'm renewing my vows with Albert." Franklin's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "So I've heard. And what exactly do you expect me to say to that?" "I'm not asking for your permission," Sophia replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm here because I think you deserve to know. But this is my life. And I'm choosing how to live it." His eyes narrowed, his temper flaring. "So you're choosing to throw everything away?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Sophia said, her voice calm and resolute. "I'm choosing a life that makes me happy, a life where I get to be myself." "And what about the life I built for you?" Franklin demanded, his voice rising. "The wealth, the opportunities, everything I've worked for, are you just going to walk away from it all?" Sophia held his gaze, unwavering. "You built that life for yourself, Dad, not for me. I never asked for any of it." The words hit Franklin Parker like a cold slap. He had always believed that everything he did was for Sophia, that all his hard work, every success, was for her benefit. But now, standing before her, he realized that he had never truly considered what she wanted, only what he thought she should want. "You're making a mistake," Franklin said, his voice dangerously low. "Albert is beneath you. He'll never be able to give you the life you deserve." Sophia shook her head, a small, sad smile on her lips. "That's where you're wrong. Albert is exactly what I need. He's kind, steady, and he loves me for who I am, not for what I have." Franklin's hands clenched into fists. "You think love is enough? You think you can live on love alone? You're being naive, Sophia." "I'm being happy," she replied, her voice more confident than he had ever heard it. "And I'm not going to let you take that away from me." The room fell silent, a thick tension settling between them. Franklin stared at his daughter, his mind racing, feeling his control slipping through his fingers. For the first time, a foreign emotion crept into his heart, fear. Fear that he had lost her for good. "I love you, Dad," Sophia said softly, her tone softening. "But I need to live my own life now. I hope someday you'll understand that." Without another word, she turned and walked out of his office, leaving him alone in silence, facing the painful realization of what his control had cost him. Underscore 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 underscore. The day Sophia had longed for finally arrived, carrying with it a quiet sense of clarity. As the sun began to rise over Wind Valley Churchyard, casting a soft, golden light over the rows of grapevines, the air was cool and still. Today felt different from her original wedding day back then. It had felt like a punishment. Today it felt like freedom. This time she was making her own choice. Standing before a small mirror in Athena House, Sophia adjusted her simple white dress. It wasn't the grand gown she once imagined for herself, but it was perfect, a reflection of the life she was about to embrace, a life defined by love and authenticity, not luxury or status. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Sophia's heart fluttered with anticipation. The last few weeks had been filled with moments of self-reflection, of growth, of discovering happiness in the simplest things. Albert had shown her what that could look like, not by trying to change her, but simply by being himself, a steady, kind presence. As she stepped outside, she saw Albert waiting, dressed in a simple suit, his hair neatly combed. His gaze was calm and full of love, but today there was something deeper in his eyes. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his smile warm and genuine. Sophia felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look pretty good yourself." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of their journey settling between them like a shared secret. This wasn't just a renewal of vows, it was a new beginning, one they were choosing together. "Ready?" Albert asked, extending his hand. Sophia slipped her hand into his, nodding. More than ever. Together, they walked to a small clearing in the charred yard where the ceremony would take place. It was a simple setting, a few chairs, a wooden arch adorned with wildflowers, and rows of grapevines stretching out as far as they could see. There were no guests, no grand celebration, just the two of them, standing side by side, ready to commit on their own terms. For the first time in her life, Sophia didn't care about the absence of an audience or any lavish details. This was real. And it was everything she wanted. As the officiant began, Sophia felt waves of emotion wash over her. She glanced at Albert, who held her gaze with that steady, reassuring look, and she felt the truth of their journey. They had started as strangers bound by obligation, but today they stood as equals bound by choice. When it came time for her vows, Sophia took a deep breath and turned to Albert, her heart pounding as she spoke. "Albert," she began, her voice soft but steady. "When we first married, I didn't understand what love was. I thought happiness meant wealth, status, and approval. But you've shown me it's not about what you have, it's about who you share your life with. You've taught me more about love, kindness, and patience than I ever thought possible. Today, I choose you not because I have to, but because I want to. I choose you as my partner, my friend, and my love for the rest of my life." Albert's eyes shone with emotion, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a tenderness that made Sophia's heart ache in the most beautiful way. "Sophia," he said, keeping his gaze fixed on her. "I never expected this, especially not the way it happened. But from the moment we started this journey, I knew there was something special about you. You're strong, determined, and so full of life. Every day you've shown me that love isn't about grand gestures or material things. It's about the quiet moments when it's just us. I choose you, Sophia. Today, tomorrow, and every day after that. I'm so grateful to be standing here with you, knowing this is just the beginning of our story." Tears filled Sophia's eyes as the officiant smiled and pronounced them husband and wife once again. There was no applause, no crowd, but that didn't matter. This moment was perfect. Albert leaned in and kissed her softly, and Sophia felt a sense of completeness settle over her. This was her life now, a life she had chosen. Hand in hand, they walked back through the charred yard, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. Sophia looked up at Albert, her heart brimming with love and gratitude. "I never thought I'd find this," she whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. Albert smiled, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Neither did I. They walked in contented silence, the peaceful sounds of the charred yard surrounding them. Words were unnecessary, they both understood the significance of this day. A fresh start. A promise of a future filled with love, joy, and the simple beauty of life together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia looked out over the charred yard, feeling the warmth of Albert's hand in hers. For the first time in her life, she felt deeply, beautifully, exactly where she was meant to be. One crisp morning, while Sophia was straightening up Athena House, she came across a folded, elegant business magazine on the small coffee table in the living room. She hadn't seen it before, nor had she remembered Albert ever bringing one inside. Intrigued, she opened it, only to have her breath catch in her throat. There, on a double-page spread, was a profile of Albert dressed in a sharp suit, his familiar steady gaze softened by an almost imperceptible smile. "Albert Hayes, the billionaire you never see," read the headline. Her heart pounded as she scanned the words, which painted a picture of a man entirely different from the one she thought she knew. Albert was not only wealthy, he was richer than her father, Franklin, with investments spanning real estate, technology, and even parts of the agriculture industry. He'd left the boardroom for a quieter life, the article explained, choosing to pursue a life far removed from the glitz and glamour of his vast empire. Sophia felt the room close in around her. Her hands shook as she placed the magazine down. She thought of the Albert she knew, the humble gardener, the quiet man who seemed content to live simply. How much of it had been an act? Her mind raced with questions she could hardly grasp, each one forming a web of confusion, disbelief, and somewhere deep within a simmering anger. Lost in her thoughts, she hardly noticed Albert entering until his voice broke the silence. "Sophia? Are you okay?" He took a step closer, his brow furrowing in concern. She turned to him, her face pale, holding up the magazine. "Care to explain this?" Albert's face froze, and a shadow of realization fell over his expression. He opened his mouth as if to say something but stopped, his gaze shifting from the magazine to her eyes. "I can explain," he began softly. Sophia swallowed, her voice shaky yet firm. "I think you'd better." He took a deep breath, stepping closer but stopping as he saw her draw back instinctively. "I didn't plan for you to find out this way, Sophia." "So you were planning on hiding it from me forever?" Her voice was tight, her anger bubbling beneath the surface. "No," Albert replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I was going to tell you, but I didn't know how." "You're a billionaire," she said, incredulous. "All this time I thought you were this simple, kind, down-to-earth man, and now it turns out you're richer than my father, that I lied?" He interrupted, his voice laced with regret. "Yes, I suppose it must feel that way. But you have to understand, I never wanted you to see me for what I owned or what people think I am. I wanted you to know me, just me." Sophia clenched her fists, struggling to contain the emotions threatening to spill over. "But you made me believe that you were someone else, Albert. That you were living this simple life, that we were in this together. You've been living a lie right next to me." Albert's expression softened, his eyes reflecting his own pain. "Sophia, please, just let me explain." "Then explain," she snapped, her voice wavering. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly before speaking. "I wanted to step away from the life I'd been living. It was exhausting, and I had lost sight of what mattered. I came here to Wind Valley to remember what it felt like to work, to create something with my hands, to live simply without the weight of expectations and the loneliness that comes with that world." Sophia's gaze softened for a moment, but her confusion and hurt remained. "Why this vineyard, Albert? Why our vineyard? Out of all the places you could have gone, why did you come here?" He looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I knew you would be here." Sophia's heart pounded. "What are you saying?" Albert turned back to her, his gaze steady, his voice filled with emotion. "I've known you longer than you realize, Sophia. Years ago, I saw you at a fundraiser. You were there with your father, and you looked lonely, just like me. You had that same look in your eyes, like you were searching for something. I never forgot that moment. And then, when I found out your family owned Wind Valley, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could." "You could what?" "Walk in here and play the humble gardener until I fell for you?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Albert, this feels like a betrayal. I thought I could trust you. I thought you were real." He stepped closer, his face etched with desperation. "Sophia, I am real. This is who I am. The life I've built here, the man I've tried to become, all of it is real. But I didn't want you to see me as a billionaire. I wanted you to see me to love me, without any of the noise or assumptions that money brings. But it's not that simple, she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. You let me believe in something that wasn't true. You took my pain, my anger at my father, and used it as a way to make me yours. Albert's face fell. That's not true. I didn't mean to hurt you, Sophia. All I wanted was for you to know me without the barriers that money brings. But you built those barriers yourself, Albert, she replied, voice breaking. You chose to hide this part of yourself, knowing that someday I'd have to face the truth. He paused, guilt flashing across his face. I thought it would be different, that when the time came you'd understand, that it wouldn't matter. Sophia drew a shaky breath, crossing her arms as if to shield herself. You don't get to decide when that truth comes out, Albert. That was my choice to make, and you took it from me. Albert's eyes softened, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia, please, I love you. She shook her head, stepping back. I don't know if I can believe that. You've been hiding such a huge part of yourself. I don't even know who you are anymore. The silence between them felt insurmountable, filled with the weight of unsaid words and broken trust. Albert looked at her, his heart clearly breaking, but he stayed quiet, as though respecting her need for space. Finally he spoke, his voice filled with quiet pain. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Sophia bit her lip, unsure of her answer. Part of her wanted to run, to put as much distance between them as possible, while another part longed for the warmth of his embrace. She closed her eyes, her voice strained as she replied, I don't know, Albert. I don't know if you can. She turned away, the weight of their conversation pressing down on her like a physical burden. She felt the tears she'd been holding back finally slip free, and she didn't look back as she made her way inside Athena House, leaving Albert standing alone in the early morning light. In the days that followed, Sophia kept her distance from Albert, needing time to sort through the tangle of emotions his revelation had unleashed. She spent her days wandering the charred yard, avoiding places where she might run into him, as memories of their time together played endlessly in her mind. Albert tried to reach out, leaving notes and flowers by her door, each one carefully worded, but she left them untouched. She couldn't bring herself to confront him, nor could she bring herself to move past the anger she felt. The betrayal lingered, poisoning the memories of their quiet moments together. One evening, as she stood by the rows of vines, watching the sunset cast long shadows over the hills, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Albert, his face shadowed but his gaze intent. I know I'm the last person you want to see, he said quietly, stopping a few paces away. But I can't stand this silence anymore. I need to tell you everything. She looked at him, her eyes weary but unyielding. What more could you possibly have to say, Albert? I know you're rich. I know you deceived me. What else is there? He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. I want you to know that, despite everything, my feelings for you are real. I never meant to manipulate you. I came here because I needed to know if I could be someone you could love, without the trappings of my wealth. Sophia's face softened, her anger flickering into something more vulnerable. And now that I know, what do you expect me to do? Just accept it and pretend none of this happened. No, he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. I don't expect anything. I needed you to know the truth. I understand if you never want to forgive me, if you need time, or even if you choose to walk away. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't give you the choice. They stood in silence, the distance between them feeling as vast as the life he'd hidden from her. Sophia looked down, her heart aching with confusion and longing. Part of her yearned to take his hand to tell him she could forgive him, but the wound was still fresh, and the trust that had once bound them felt broken. Finally, she looked up, her gaze steady. I don't know if I can forgive you, Albert. Maybe someday. But not now. Albert nodded, accepting her words with quiet grace. I understand, and whatever you decide, I'll be here waiting. He turned to leave, and for a brief moment, Sophia wanted to call out, to tell him she would try, that she wanted to rebuild. But as he disappeared into the shadows of the charred yard, she knew she needed time to heal, to reconcile, and perhaps, to find her way back to him in her own time. Sophia Parker sat in her father's study, her hands still trembling from the whirlwind of emotions that had overwhelmed her since learning about Albert's true identity. Her father, Franklin Parker, a composed, wise man with a calm smile and perceptive eyes, looked up from his book as she entered, immediately sensing the turmoil within her. Sophia, what's on your mind? His voice, deep and reassuring, had always brought her comfort, a grounding warmth that she needed now more than ever. Sophia swallowed, feeling the weight of her discovery settle heavily on her heart. Dad, I just found out something that's difficult to wrap my head around. Franklin set his book aside, his full attention on her now. Take your time, sweetheart. I'm here to listen. Sophia drew a shaky breath, then began her story, recounting every moment she'd shared with Albert, from the first spark of charm he'd shown, to the peaceful days spent side by side at Wind Valley Chardyard. She described his humility, his quiet nature, and how she had come to care for him deeply. Her voice grew softer as she spoke about the discovery of his true wealth and status, the magazine article, and the overwhelming confrontation that followed. When she finally finished, her father leaned back thoughtfully, carefully processing her words. And now I don't know what to think, Sophia whispered, her voice breaking. I feel betrayed. He was so genuine to me, so grounded. And now it feels like I was caught in a lie. Why didn't he just tell me, Dad? Franklin exhaled deeply, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. I can understand why you feel this way, Sophia, but I believe there's more to this story than you might realize. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? A gentle smile crossed her father's face. What if I told you that I knew who Albert was all along? Sophia's eyes widened in shock. You knew? Franklin nodded, his gaze understanding and calm. Yes, I knew that Albert was wealthy, even before he arrived here. In fact, he reached out to me before he ever set foot on our vineyard. Sophia felt a swirl of emotions, confusion, surprise, and somehow a pang of betrayal all over again. Why didn't you tell me, Dad? You knew. And you kept it from me. He sighed, his tone tender yet firm. Because, Sophia, I wanted you to learn something valuable. I wanted you to get to know Albert for who he truly is, not for his wealth or status. I thought that if you could see him without the burden of his fortune overshadowing him, you'd understand what he holds dear. Sophia's mind reeled. But he still lied, Dad. He kept such a huge part of himself from me. Yes, he did, Franklin acknowledged gently. But he likely did so because he feared his wealth would drive a wedge between you, as it often has with others in his life. He took a pause. Albert and I had a deep conversation before he joined us here. He shared that he was looking for something real, something that wasn't colored by his wealth. He wanted a chance to live honestly, to experience a life where he could simply be himself. Sophia lowered her gaze, absorbing her father's words. She had always seen Albert as authentic, kind, and gentle, and yet his hidden truth had hurt her deeply. So, you believe he did it for honesty's sake? Franklin nodded. I think he did it to find something he could hold close, something real that wasn't influenced by money or power. Sophia took a deep breath, feeling a shift inside. But why would he go through all of that? To live such a humble life? Franklin leaned forward, his eyes soft with understanding. When you're born into a world of wealth, Sophia, you often spend your life wondering if anyone truly sees you. Albert has spent his years surrounded by people who only saw him as a means to an end. Coming here, living simply, working on the vineyard, these were his ways of searching for authenticity. He wanted to find someone who would care for him as he is, not for what he has. A tear slipped down Sophia's cheek, and she quickly brushed it away. He could have just told me, though. I would have understood. Would you? Franklin asked gently. Think carefully, Sophia. If he had come here and introduced himself as Albert Hayes, billionaire, would you have let yourselves get close to him so easily? She paused, the truth settling uncomfortably in her heart. I don't know. Maybe not. But it still hurt, Dad. I know it did, sweetheart, he said, pulling her into a comforting hug. But remember, love isn't always about what's said or done. Sometimes it's about understanding the motives behind those actions. Albert didn't lie to deceive you. He did it to protect something fragile and precious to him. He's human, and humans make mistakes, especially when they're afraid of losing what they care about. Sophia took a deep breath, letting her father's words sink in. A newfound clarity began to emerge, blending with the hurt and confusion. So, you think he truly cares about me? Franklin gave her a gentle smile. I do. And I believe he's willing to risk everything just to be near you, even if it meant living a life completely outside of his comfort zone. Sophia nodded, warmth spreading through her heart. Her father was right. She needed to face Albert not with anger but with honesty, to fully understand his intentions and perhaps to find forgiveness. That evening, Sophia found herself standing outside Albert's modest cottage on the grounds of Wind Valley Chardyard. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rows of grapevines, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself before knocking on the door. After a brief moment, Albert opened the door, his face a mixture of surprise and hope. "Sophia? Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice revealing the vulnerability she felt. He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat down in the cozy living room, silence filling the space before Sophia finally spoke. "Albert, I spoke with my father." Albert's gaze softened and he nodded as though he had expected this. "I see. Did he tell you about me?" "Yes," she replied, holding his gaze. "He told me about your conversation before you came here, about why you wanted to live a simpler life." Albert sighed, looking down at his hands. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I never wanted to hurt you. I needed to know that someone could see me for me, not for my wealth. I wanted to experience a connection that wasn't tainted by money." Sophia placed her hand over his. "I think I understand that now, Albert. But you need to know, finding out this way was painful. I felt like everything between us was a lie." Albert met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "I know. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I love you, Sophia. That's why I wanted to be here, to live life with you as authentically as possible, free of the burdens my wealth often brings." Sophia's heart softened as she looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of sincerity there. She took a deep breath, allowing her heart to open as she spoke. "Albert, I've realized that I love you too. And maybe that's why this hurts so much. Because I thought I had lost something real. But maybe I can learn to trust you again." Albert's face brightened with hope, and he gently squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Sophia. That's all I could ever hope for." They sat quietly, a sense of peaceful understanding settling between them. Sophia rested her head on Albert's shoulder, feeling a calmness she hadn't felt in days. She knew that their journey together wouldn't be without challenges, but she also knew that love was worth every effort. As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting Wind Valley in hues of pink and orange, Sophia felt a renewed sense of hope. Albert might have come from a world of wealth, but here, in the peaceful beauty of the vineyard, he had found a home in her heart, and she knew without question that they would face whatever the future held together, building a love as true and enduring as the land they both cherished.